Chapter 1. The gallows cast down. Dawn came to Sleckburg like a browse. The sky over the town was not yet bright, only thinning from black to a dirty violet behind the broken rooftops and chimney stacks. Mist dragged low over the crooked streets, carrying with it the mixed stinks of dung, wood smoke, river rot, wet dog, and old blood. The market square looked as though it had been built out of spite rather than craft. All leaning timber houses and sagging eaves, hemming in a patch of churned earth gone hard with frost. In the middle of it stood the gallows, black against the paling sky, its wood warped and swollen from years of rain, its crossbeams scarred by rope burn and weather, its base crusted with filth where men had pissed on it for luck or contempt. A body had hung there 3 days before. The mark of its swinging boots was still visible in the mud. Now another man waited beneath it. He stood with a noose around his neck and his hands tied in front of him with hemp rope darkened by sweat and use. He was not old, though fear had put 20 years into his face in a single night. His beard was patchy and stiff with frost. One eye was swollen near shut, the lid split where someone had struck him with a ring or a mailed fist. His lower lip had burst and dried into a dark crust. He wore only a torn shirt, ragged hose, and a sleeveless leather jerkin, far too little against the morning cold. His feet were bare, the skin had gone blue at the toes. His name, according to the crier who had shouted it 3 times, was Lucas Heller, horse thief, cutpurse, killer. According to the woman weeping into her apron near the front of the crowd, he was also a cooper's son, a fool, and no killer at all. The people of Schlechtburg had come to watch anyway. They stood packed shoulder to shoulder around the square, muttering into their collars and scarves, stamping numb boots against the ground. There were fishwives with red hands, charcoal burners, carters, ragged children with streaming noses, a cluster of tradesmen, and a knot of hard-faced labourers, fresh from the river warehouses. Their breath smoked in the air. Their eyes had the bright, ugly glitter of folk grateful not to be the one standing under the rope. Some had come to see justice. More had come to see a man kick himself to death. At the foot of the scaffold stood Bailiff Clems, thick as a barrel, and wrapped in a wolf fur mantle gone bald at the collar. His cheeks were purple with broken veins, his nose raw from drink, his small eyes mean and wet. One gloved hand rested on the pommel of a short sword he had likely never drawn in earnest. Beside him loomed the hangman, a giant in a stained leather hood. The man's apron was waxed and stiff with old fluids, and his arms looked thick enough to twist a bull's neck. In one meaty hand he held the coil of rope not yet passed over the beam. The fibers rasped softly as he shifted his grip. "Lucas Heller," said Bailiff Clems, loud enough for the square to hear, "found guilty of theft, murder, and evasion of lawful seizure, by sentence of town law, confirmed by witness and seal. You are to be hanged by the neck until dead." Lucas swallowed. The noose creaked against his skin. "I never killed him," he said, though his voice was little more than a crack in the morning air. "By Sigmar, I never killed old Brenner. I stole the horse. I'll not lie on that. But he was dead when The bailiff struck him across the face with a rolled parchment. It was not a hard blow, but it made Lucas flinch like a whipped dog. "Save your breath," Clem said. "You'll spend it soon enough." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, mean and thin. The woman who had been crying made a sound like something torn inside her. No one looked at her. Mercy was a private thing in Schlechtburg, and shame a public feast. The hangman mounted the scaffold with heavy, deliberate steps. The boards groaned beneath his weight. He passed the rope over the crossbeam with practiced economy, drew it taut, and tested the knot. Then he looked down to Bailiff Clems and gave a single nod. The square seemed to hold itself still. Even the crows on the roofs had gone quiet. Clems opened his mouth to give the signal. A horse screamed somewhere in the fog. Heads turned toward the eastern street, where the town gate road ran between two rows of sagging houses. Out of the mist came the sharp ring of iron shoes on frozen cobbles, slow at first, then measured and inexorable. The sound did not hurry. It announced itself like a challenge. People shifted aside without being told. A path opened through the square, almost by instinct, as if a blade were passing through flesh. The rider emerged from the grey in a wash of crimson and black. He sat a massive destrier, armored at brow and chest, its flanks steaming in the cold. The beast's barding was worked in dark steel, chased with old silver, scarred by cuts and dents that had never been polished away. Upon its back rode a knight encased in plate of a deep, arterial red. Not bright enamel, not courtly finery, but the red of clotted blood seen by firelight. His armor was severe and ancient, ridged at the pauldrons, fluted at the vambraces, the edges engraved with sigils so worn they looked gnawed by time. A long black cloak hung from his shoulders. Frost clung to it. At his hip rode a long sword in a black scabbard wrapped with wire dark leather. The hilt was simple, the pommel heavy, the guard nicked and stained. His helmet was tucked beneath one arm. The face beneath was deathly handsome, and all the worse for it. Pale skin stretched tight over hard cheekbones, black hair bound back with a leather thong, a mouth too still to be called calm, eyes the color of old garnets, cold and lustrous as wet meat. He looked neither left nor right as he rode into the square. People near him recoiled all the same, some from the aura of rank, others from something more ancient and instinctive, some buried animal knowledge that cried out from beneath layers of piety and stupidity. The horse halted before the scaffold. No one spoke. Lord Varek Drow looked up at the man under the noose, then at the gallows itself. His gaze moved over the warped beam, the frayed fibers, the bird droppings, the old stains, the clumsy carpentry of death. He regarded it with the same expression a nobleman might reserve for a midden heap discovered beside his supper table. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the square. "Who ordered this?" Bailiff Clems drew himself up. He made a show of authority, though the movement had a stiffness to it now. "I am the town bailiff," he said. "This is lawful sentence." Draal's eyes lowered to him. Nothing changed in the vampire's face, but the square grew colder. "Lawful," he repeated, as though tasting something sour. "Perhaps. Honorable? No." Clems blustered because men like him always did when they sensed they had walked onto rotten ice. "This is no concern of yours, my lord. The condemned is a thief and murderer. The town has judgment over its own." Draal dismounted in one fluid motion. He landed without sound despite the weight of his armor. That alone made some in the crowd murmur and cross themselves. He walked toward the scaffold steps, with his gauntlets hanging at his belt and his cloak trailing behind him. He did not hurry. Men moved out of his path too late. stumbling over one another to avoid the brush of his armor. The hangman shifted his stance above, uncertain now. "Stay where you are," said Clems, louder than before. "In the name of—" The sword came out so fast the eye lagged behind it. There was no flourish, no shouted challenge, no theatricality. One instant the black scabbard hung at Dral's side. In the next, naked steel flashed in the dawn like a strip of winter light. Dral turned his wrist once. The blade described a short, contemptuous arc. Bailiff Clems's right hand fell into the mud. For a heartbeat the bailiff merely stared, uncomprehending, at the ragged stump spraying blood through his glove. Then the pain found him. He screamed so hard his knees folded. He toppled sideways into the filth, clutching his forearm as blood pulsed between his fingers in thick red jets. The severed hand twitched in the square, fingers spasming open and shut as if still trying to cling to authority. The crowd broke into shouts. Some stumbled back. Some surged forward for a better look. One woman fainted dead away and vanished under the elbows of her neighbors. The hangman bellowed and came down from the scaffold with murder in both fists, swinging a length of rope weighted by the knot. Dral stepped inside the swing, his blade thrust upward under the hangman's chin. The point punched through leather hood, flesh, tongue, and palate with a wet cracking sound, then burst from the crown of the executioner's skull in a spray of blood and grey matter. The giant's momentum carried him another half step before he froze, eyes bulging beneath the hood. Blood gouted down the front of his apron in thick, pumping sheets. Dral wrenched the sword free. Something came with it, a string of spit, brain, and blackened clot. The hangman toppled backward off the scaffold steps. He hit the ground with such force that one of his boots flew off. He kicked twice, heels drumming in the frost, and went still. Silence crashed over the square. Clems moaned in the mud, whimpering through his teeth, his severed wrist bubbling red. Dral wiped his blade once on the dead hangman's apron and sheathed it. Then he mounted the scaffold. Lucas Heller stared at him with the trapped horror of a man who has just discovered the wolf has interrupted the butcher. Dral stood close enough for the condemned to smell cold iron, old grave dirt, and something coppery beneath it all. "No man," Dral said, loud enough for the square, "should die by rope." He reached up and loosened the noose from Lucas's neck. The frayed hemp hissed against swollen skin. When the loop fell away, Lucas sagged, coughing. Dral turned to the crowd. "You kill like peasants slaughtering pigs," he said. "Drop, choke, kick, void the guts, and call it justice. A dog's death, a thief's death, cattle work." No one answered him. Even the braver hecklers kept their mouths shut. Men were looking at Clems's stump, at the hangman's open skull, at the poised, impossible stillness of the red-armored stranger. Somewhere behind the front ranks, a child began to cry. "If blood demands answer," Dral continued, "let steel answer it. If a life is to be weighed, let it be weighed at dawn, in sight of heaven, by strength and courage. Let the accused stand through a champion. Let the dead have a champion as well. Let guilt and innocence be cut from one another beneath the rising sun." The words should have sounded mad in that broken square. Instead they hung in the air with a terrible, seductive gravity. Schleckburg was a town steeped in violence, so common it had gone stale. Men were stabbed over cards, women beaten over grudges, cousins knifed over inheritance, drunks clubbed in alleys for boots. Hanging was only the final clumsy punctuation mark on a sentence written in blood. And here, before them all, stood something ancient and monstrous, offering not mercy, but shape, not kindness, but form. Bailiff Clems lifted his head, face ash-pale and slick with tears. "You cannot," he gasped, "you cannot make law here." Drow looked down at him from the scaffold. "I already have." He descended, took Clems by the collar, one-handed, and dragged him through the square, as easily as a man drags a sack of grain. The bailiff shrieked, his boots furrowing the mud behind him, his bloody stump smearing a long red trail. Drow hauled him all the way to the base of the gallows, then flung him against the uprights hard enough to make the old timber shudder. "Repair this town," Drow said, "or perish with it." Then he left Clems sobbing there and walked to his horse. No one barred his way. By noon the proclamation had gone out, first by word of mouth, then by shaken crier. The gallows would stand no longer as the final sentence for capital crime. Any murder, any slaying of grave weight, any hanging matter would be judged by duel at dawn beyond the eastern wall. Champion for accused, champion for victim. The town muttered and spat and crossed itself. Some called it blasphemy, some called it madness, some, quieter than the rest, called it better. That very next morning they gathered outside the walls to see whether the new law was a passing fit or a thing with teeth. The field east of Schlechtburg lay hard under white frost, the grass silvered and brittle, the earth beneath frozen to iron. A stand of black trees loomed beyond it, bare branches like grasping fingers against the whitening sky. The townsfolk ringed the dueling ground in cloaks and patched wool, stamping against the cold. Their breath drifted around them like battlefield smoke. Priests muttered prayers. Sellswords took measure of one another. Housewives clutched shawls to their throats and stared with guilty hunger. In the center stood the first two champions. For the accused, Lucas Heller. There was his elder brother Matthias, broad-shouldered, red-eyed from drink and grief, armed with a woodcutter's axe newly sharpened. For old Brenner, the dead ostler whose killing had put Lucas under the rope, there stood Brenner's nephew Otto, a former militiaman, with a notched arming sword and a round shield painted long ago in the colors of some forgotten levy. Between them sat Lord Varek Drowl upon his horse, watching. No herald sang, no drum rolled. The sunrise itself seemed to hold breath behind the horizon. "Begin," Drowl said. Otto rushed first, shield high, sword darting. Matthias met him with a hacking blow that smashed into the shield rim and tore a splintering chunk from it. The impact boomed across the frozen field. Otto stumbled sideways, boots skidding on the frost. Matthias followed with another chop aimed at the head. Otto ducked and drove in close, stabbing low. The sword punched into Matthias's thigh to the half. Blood spilled black-red over the frost. Matthias roared like an ox under the hammer. He dropped the axe, one-handed, seized Otto's shield by its boss, and yanked. The two men slammed together chest to chest, grunting, breath steaming hot in one another's faces. Otto hacked with the sword hilt, breaking Matthias's nose in a wet crunch. Blood sheeted down through the woodcutter's beard. Matthias answered by sinking his teeth into Otto's ear and ripping half of it away. The scream that followed turned the crowd rabid. Men shouted. Women clapped hands to mouths. Someone laughed too hard. A boy vomited into the grass and kept watching. Otto reeled back, one side of his head painted red, and Matthias snatched up the fallen axe. He swung from the shoulder. Otto got the shield in the way, but too late and not enough. The blade split wood, punched through the boss, and buried itself in Otto's forearm beneath. Flesh opened to the bone. The hand on the shield convulsed. Fingers sprayed blood as they spasmed. Otto fell to one knee, shrieking. Matthias tried to wrench the axe free. It stuck. Otto came up under it, with the sword in his good hand, and rammed the point into Matthias's belly. Mail links burst. The blade drove in deep. With a thick, obscene sound like a butcher's knife pushed into wet offal. Matthias made a noise too ugly to be called a cry. He sagged over the shield, his guts hot and slippery under his jerkin. Otto tore the sword out and stabbed again, this time into the side of the neck. Blood jetted across the frost in a bright fan. Matthias dropped to both knees, mouth working soundlessly, hands opening and closing around nothing. Otto stood swaying above him, face half masked in blood, and hacked downward, once, twice, 3 times until the woodcutter collapsed face first, twitching. The field fell quiet except for Matthias's dying kicks. He shuddered for a while. Then even that stopped. Frost around the body melted pink. Drow surveyed the corpse with an expression approaching satisfaction. Not pleasure, not yet. Something more austere. Appraisal. Approval. He turned his gaze toward Lucas Heller, who stood under guard at the edge of the field and watched his brother's body leak itself into the ground. "Judgment is rendered," said the vampire. The crowd began to murmur at once, shocked, excited, sickened, fascinated. The thing had been brutal, ugly, and terribly alive. No swaying rope, no choking dance. Steel had bitten. Blood had answered blood. Already, the story was changing shape in their minds, becoming something larger, cleaner, almost noble in recollection, though it had been nothing of the sort. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, weak and pale and cold, 2 black-clad servants emerged from the waiting cart behind Duel. They wore no livery anyone knew, only plain dark wool and leather gloves. Without a word, they lifted Matthias's body. His head lolled, neck half open, blood dripping from beard and sleeve. One of the men gathered the severed ear lying in the frost and tucked it into the dead man's slack hand as if returning lost property. Lucas cried out for his brother, but the servants ignored him. They carried the corpse not toward the town chapel, nor to the priest, nor to grieving kin, but to Duel's covered wagon. Some in the crowd made the sign of the hammer. Others looked away. None stepped forward. The canvas curtain dropped. Lord Varric Duel sat straight-backed in the saddle, crimson armor wet with dawnlight, and watched the people of Schlechtburg stare at the wagon that held their dead. In that silence, with the frost steaming where blood had spilled and the first sun of morning crawling over the field, the town understood without speaking it aloud. The gallows had been cast down. Something far worse had taken its place. Chapter 2. A Better Law, a Worse Hunger. By the 6th week of Lord Varric Duel's law, Schlechtburg no longer smelled like a town trying to survive. It smelled like a town learning to feed. The old stink was still there, buried underneath everything else. Fish scales gone sour by the river docks, piss steaming in alley corners, dung from mule carts, chimney soot, wet leather, old rot creeping up from cellar floors. But now there was another scent braided through it, richer and more intimate. fresh blood on straw, tallow smoke in crowded rooms, iron and sweat. Cheap perfume splashed on the throats of camp followers, horse grease, oiled mail, cured hides. Men in from the roads carried the world on them, mud from Averland tracks, marsh stink from Stirland fens, incense from temple barracks, the unwashed heat of tourney tents and fighting pits. Slechtburg drank it all in and wore it like a fever. What had once been a sullen river town of coopers, ostlers, chandlers, fishermen, and grain factors had begun to warp itself around the dawn duels, as flesh warps around an arrowhead. The inns filled first. The Crooked Saint, once a sagging alehouse where rivermen pissed against the hearth and slept with knives in their boots, now housed mailed retainers, two to a bed and sword hands under the tables. The Candle and Pike turned out its long-time regulars to make room for a band of Estalian bravos with scarred cheeks and lacquered scabbards, men who smiled with all their teeth and measured every wrist in the room for speed. The widow Merschel, who had run a quiet beer cellar out of her cellar and back room for 15 years, discovered that she could triple her prices overnight if she served stew to hedge knights and pit brawlers who came to sell their blades as champions. Before long, her daughter was washing blood off the benches at dawn and vomit off the step at dusk. Everywhere, men asked the same questions, in different words. Who speaks for the accused? Who stands for the dead? What is the charge worth? Who saw it? Who swore it? Who will pay? A man could hardly buy onions in the market without overhearing some argument about whose cousin had claim to vengeance, whether a wife might hire a sword in place of her lame husband, whether killing in drunkenness counted as murder if the victim had struck first, whether a priest's testimony outweighed that of 2 dockmen, whether a champion had the right to inspect his opponent's blade before sunrise, whether poison voided the duel, whether a broken oath made one dishonored enough to be denied proper representation. The town had found a new liturgy, and it was spoken in the accents of grievance and steel. Children played duelists in the alleys with willow sticks, squealing as they mimicked the killing thrust. They gave one another names like Red Otto, Hookface Len, Three-Finger Jur, and Widow's Wolf, names torn from men who had bled before dawn while the town watched and cheered. Housewives carried gossip from the pump about who had won and who had screamed longest. Old men with cataracts, who had once slept through every hanging, now dragged stools out to the roadside before first light, so they could be among the first to the frost field. The square itself had changed. It was no longer merely the town's market. It had become a stage, where onions, eels, turnips, mutton, lamp oil, and rough homespun had once dominated the barrows. There were now stalls selling sword belts, bucklers, whetstones, salves for cuts, strips of boiled leather to bite through, cheap charms against bad steel, powders to dry blood from gloves, ribbons in mourning colors, and little painted icons of Sigmar, Mor, Verena, and Ulrich, for people who wanted piety close at hand while they watched men open one another from groin to gullet. There were scribes too thin, hungry clerks with stained fingers, ready to draft formal accusations for a fee, or record redresses, declarations, witness testimonies, oaths of kinship, claims of blood debt, renunciations of challenge, notices of paid champions, all neatly copied and sealed to give ancient shape to whatever squalid little hatred had flared in a tenement or tavern. And above it all, as naturally as a carrion bird on a church spire, Lord Varick Dral, presided. He had taken up residence in the old Vote Manor on the rise above the graveyard, a stone house, half fortified and half rotted, where moss climbed the walls and ravens strutted on the parapets. The last family to own it had died out in fever 2 generations earlier. Nobody in Schlechtburg had dared claim it since. Now its windows glowed red gold at night. Men-at-arms in dark brigandines stood at the gate, silent and broad-backed beneath kettle helms. The lord's black wagons came and went at odd hours. Supplies vanished up the hill. Meat, wine, lamp oil, firewood, linen, iron, beeswax, bolts of dark cloth. Sometimes, after a duel, a body went that way too. At first, no one had spoken of that part. No one wanted to be first. The losers, it was said, were being prepared for proper burial under Dral's supervision. The law was new, and the old priest of Mor, Father Heilwig, was lame with gout and nearly blind in one eye. Things required organization, dignity, time. Besides, some corpses came back. Not all vanished, but those that returned were wrong. Greta Morn, widow to a cooper and mother to the drover boy Hannes, who had died in the 3rd week fighting as champion for his drunken brother, was the first to say it aloud. She said it in the charnel yard behind the temple, with Father Heilwig present and the barber surgeon Conrad Veit up to his elbows in lye water, and once she had spoken it, nobody could quite pretend otherwise. "They drained him," she whispered. Hannes lay on the washing board beneath a wool cloth, naked from throat to heel, his skin scrubbed clean of dirt but not of violence. He had taken a spear in the duel, though the formalists called it a partisan to make it sound finer than it was. The thrust had entered under his arm and torn through lung and ribs. The wound was there, ugly and black-edged, stitched crudely shut by someone who did not care whether a mother would see it. There were defensive cuts on his palms, a broken nose flattened to one side, 3 teeth gone, his left ear half severed, and bruising around the throat where he had likely been held while dying. But all that was not what made Greta's voice shake. It was the color of him. Hannes had not gone grey with death. He had gone pale, almost wax-white beneath the clots and bruises, as if all warmth and redness had been poured out of him. His lips were bloodless. His fingertips looked like candle ends. And there, on the side of his neck, near the corded muscle below the jaw, sat 2 neat punctures, crusted dark. Conrad Veit leaned closer, frowning through the lenses he wore for close work. He smelled of camphor, old sweat, and the sour bite of boiled instruments. His hands were cracked and stained from years of pulling teeth, setting bones, lancing boils, stitching gashes, and shaving the dead before burial. "The spear took much," he muttered. Greta made a hard noise in her throat. "More than it should." Father Heilwig crossed himself toward Mor's black altar visible through the open temple door. He was a bony old thing inside 2 large robes, with a skin like dry parchment and knotted hands that shook unless clasped very tight. "The body is a vessel," he said. "When it is broken, humors spill." Conrad glanced up at him and then back down at Hannes's neck. He touched one puncture lightly with a fingernail. "These are no spear holes." Greta stared at him. "Then say what they are." Conrad did not answer. Not because he lacked words, but because in the Empire there were some suspicions so poisonous that naming them seemed to give them teeth. After Hannes came others, a pit fighter from Nuln with an eye gouged out in the ring, and his corpse returned dry as old hide. A charcoal burner's son, whose stomach had been opened, and whose organs were blackened strangely, but who also bore those same paired marks at the neck. A Tilane with a slit belly, sent back with his face calm and white as curdled tallow, his veins collapsed under the skin. One man never came back at all, though his sister swore she had seen a wagon climbing toward the manor before dawn, with his boot hanging out beneath the canvas flap. The graveyard on the slope beneath the manor began to look disturbed. Father Helvig tried to tell himself it was foxes, then stray dogs, then grave robbers after rings and teeth, then perhaps the frost buckling the soil, but the earth was not heaved at random. Mounds sagged in narrow lines, headboards tilted. Soil had been pressed down again by booth heels and cartwheels. Some mornings there were drag marks on the wet ground leading toward the old crypts on the hill. Once Conrad found a fingernail torn off and caught in a seam of muddy stone at the crypt entrance. Another morning Greta found one of the wreaths she had laid on Hannes's grave 6 days earlier, snagged on the thorn hedge 30 yards away, stiff with frozen mud and something darker. Still, Slechtburg did not rebel. Slechtburg prospered. That was the filth of it. Under the old law, murder had been clumsy and final. A body in an alley, a hanging, a widow begging winter meal from neighbors who had little enough themselves. Under Draal's law, violence had become enterprise. Families sold heirloom brooches and silver buttons to hire famed swordsmen. Men too craven to stand for their kin paid others to do it cleanly for them. Veterans from broken regiments found work. A limping knight from Wissenland won 3 duels in 8 days and spent his earnings on velvet sleeves, imported wine, and a girl from the riverside who later showed her bruises with a smile because bruises bought bread. A one-eyed pit butcher from Talabheim made a fortune simply by agreeing to be seen sharpening his axe in public. Before long, his reputation alone was enough to frighten weaker claims into settlement. The chandlers sold more candles because people woke before dawn. The bakers sold more loaves because crowds grew hungry watching blood spill in cold fields. Even the carpenters profited making rails and viewing stands along the edge of the frost ground. Lord Draal had done what no magistrate or priest or taxman had managed in 20 years. He had made order profitable, and because order profited them, the people forgave its smell. Not all at once, not consciously, but little by little. A witness who might once have shrugged and said he had seen nothing, now found a clerk from the manor buying him beer and asking careful questions in a warm room. A feud that might have burned itself out with one broken jaw was relit by a quiet suggestion. That formal accusation carried honor, compensation, and public vindication. Men whose sons had died muttered that at least now justice could be seen in the open. Women whose husbands drank and struck them discovered that a rumor laid in the right ear might turn domestic brutality into a capital grievance if one could tie it to a suspicious death. Tradesmen used the law as a bludgeon over debt. Kin used it to settle inheritance disputes. Old humiliations were dug up, dressed in legal language, and marched into the square beneath wax seals. Lord Draal's clerks were always nearby when such opportunities arose. They were bloodless fellows in dark coats, neat as undertakers, each with ledgers and polished manners. They never threatened. They only suggested. They explained procedures. They clarified standing. They found witnesses willing to remember a little more sharply. They whispered about precedent, proper form, and the Lord's desire that grievances be aired cleanly and openly under law. Behind them, when subtlety failed, came Drawl's enforcers, mailed men with black scarves at the throat and cudgels weighted with lead. These had fewer words, but words were rarely needed after a cracked rib or a split scalp. Conrad Veidt saw enough of that to sour his stomach. He was called out more often now than in the old days, not to heal but to certify, to assess the depth of wounds, to determine whether a corpse showed signs of murder rather than accident, to examine a suspect and declare whether he was fit enough to stand represented in a duel, to stitch fighters back together if they were winners and therefore worth saving. Sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, he was summoned up to the manor itself through the side gate and into rooms that smelled of lavender, trying and failing to cover older stenches. There he treated Drawl's chosen men, favored champions, the town had begun to call them. They were the ones who won cleanly, brutally, beautifully. Men whose violence pleased the eye. Men who did not merely kill, but performed killing with efficiency or savagery so memorable that the crowd spoke of it for days afterward. Those champions found purses waiting for them, better lodgings, fresh shirts, access to the manor table, invitations to drink under Drawl's roof, praise from the Crimson Lord himself, given sparingly and therefore treasured like relics. In a town where most men had known nothing but mud, toil, and contempt, such attention was narcotic. One of those champions was Jarek Falk. He had come into Schlechtburg during the second week, a rangy bastard with a broken nose, a scar through one eyebrow, and the easy contempt of a sellsword who had lived longer than his trade ought to permit. He wore a brigandine patched so many times it resembled scaled hide, and fought with a broad infantry saber and a parrying dagger. He was not handsome, not noble, not pious. He drank hard, laughed seldom, and killed with a workman's economy that made men nervous. In 4 dawn duels he had opened a man from hip to navel, cut another through the jaw and into the throat, hamstrung a third so neatly the fellow took 3 confused steps before falling screaming, and beaten a disgraced knight to death with the pommel of his own saber, after both their blades snapped. Drawl admired him. Everyone could see it. When Jarek passed through the square, boys ran behind him and mimed his killing strokes. Drunkards bought him ale. Women appraised him. Men who would never have survived 5 breaths against him proposed employment in hushed tones. He accepted little and watched everything. That was why, perhaps, he lived long enough to notice the rot. It began with a man called Lothar Sen. Lothar had been a burly, red-bearded brawler from the riverboats, good with a cudgel and better with his fists, thick in the neck and slow in thought. Jarek had drunk with him twice, not because he liked him, but because Lothar paid for whole pitchers when flush with duel money and had an idiot's gift for repeating useful gossip. In the 5th week, Lothar had fought as champion for a tanner's family against a farmhand accused of hacking the tanner's son to death with a mattock. The duel was ugly and brief. Lothar won by smashing the farmhand's knee backward with a shield rush, and then stamping the fellow's face into the frozen turf until bone caved beneath his heel. The crowd loved it. Drawl himself had sent Lothar a silver-clasped baldric that evening. 3 days later, Lothar vanished. People said he had gone north on richer work. Others claimed he was drinking at the manor. One woman swore she had seen him carried in with his head bandaged after a private spa. No one knew. No one much cared. Men passed through Schlechtburg like lice between beggars. But Jarek remembered Lothar because debt and boasting had made the fool sticky in the mind, and because after the riverboat man vanished, his room at the Candle and Pike was found still full of belongings: cloak, spare boots, dice, a little carved bone saint blackened by thumb rubs. Even drunk men fleeing at speed took their boots. That night, after a private supper at the manor where Droll had praised Jarek's discipline of edge and nerve in a voice smooth as funeral silk, Jarek found himself led not out the front gate, but by a side passage, while two servants carried wine behind him. The manor's lower corridors were old stone, much older than the house above, built in a time when lords expected siege and burial to sit close together. The air changed as he descended. It lost the waxy warmth of the upper halls, and took on the cold, wet, mineral smell of cellars and tombs. There was another note beneath that: copper, spoiled meat, damp straw, and something medicinal, as if herbs had been burned to conceal corruption, and failed. One servant went ahead with a lantern. Its light crawled over arches, thick with moisture, and over iron-bound doors whose hinges had been recently greased. Jarek walked behind, hand loose near his saber hilt. He had been paid too well and praised too often for a mere kennel hound not to wonder where the leash ended. At the bottom of a narrow stair, the lead servant paused. "My lord requests," he said, "that you wait here." He opened a side door and gestured Jarek in with a polite little bow. Jarek stepped across the threshold and knew at once that he had been brought to the wrong sort of room to come out lucky. It was large, circular, and half subterranean, perhaps once a family vault, before being remade for uglier use. Rings had been hammered into the walls at shoulder height. The floor was strewn with sand and old black stains. There were practice dummies in armor, some slashed open, some hacked nearly to pieces. Along one side hung weapons on racks: blunted swords, rebaited spears, cudgels wrapped in leather, hooked blades, weighted chains. Straw pallets lay against the wall, and on one of them sat a figure, muttering to itself in a voice made of phlegm. Jarek's hand closed around his saber. The figure rose. It did so badly. One leg dragged. One arm hung useless and twisted, the elbow never having set right after breaking. The torso was broad, familiar. The beard had thinned in patches and was clotted dark around the mouth. The face, Sigmar preserve him, the face had been caved on one side and healed, crooked, cheekbone flattened, one eye dead and milk-white, the other tiny and fever-bright in its socket. The skull showed a dent above the temple, where bone had once broken inward. The lips had receded from the gums, exposing teeth in a permanent animal grin, and all across the throat, collar, shoulders, and chest ran scars both old and very new, crossings and punctures and ragged rents layered one atop another like a butcher's tally marks. Lothar Sen looked at Jarek Falk and made a sound of joy. Not human joy. Not any longer. The riverboat champion lurched forward, dragging one foot, hands opening and closing in little grabbing spasms. Iron links clinked behind him. A chain had been fixed to a belt around his waist, long enough to let him cross most of the room but not reach the door. His skin was corpse pale, except where livid bruising and old blood marbled it. The dead eye wept yellow fluid. The living one glittered with the pathetic eagerness of a dog that still expects praise after beatings. "Jarek," he slurred thickly, tongue not quite obeying him. "Jarek, watch this. Watch what I can." Then he snatched a rebaited sword from the wall with startling speed and came on in a rush. Whatever had been done to him had not taken all his strength. The first swing screamed through the air toward Jarek's head. Jarek slipped back and felt the wind of it across his nose. The second came low and murderous, despite the blunted edge, hard enough to smash a knee to splinters. Jarek caught it on his saber, and the impact jarred his teeth. Lothar grinned wider, spittle and black saliva stringing from his lips, and began to batter at him with a madman's zeal. Head, ribs, thigh, shoulder, thrust, backhand, pommel bash, no rhythm, no artistry, only relentless obedience and the dim thrill of performance. Jarek gave ground on the sand, parrying, turning, feeling each shock up his arm. Lothar's ruined leg made him stagger, but it also made his attacks grotesquely hard to read, his timing all wrong for a living man. The chain at his waist snapped, taut, then slackened, then taut again as he lunged and recovered like some kennel beast trained to the length of its tether. The smell of him hit Jarek between strikes, blood gone stale in cloth. Rot, una selve, sweat from fever, a grave opened too early. Lothar thrust clumsily. Jarek beat the blade aside and kicked him in the knee. The leg folded with a crack. Any normal man would have dropped. Lothar barely hissed. He slammed his forehead into Jarek's mouth instead. Teeth cut lip. Blood flooded hot and salty across Jarek's tongue. Lothar laughed wetly and swung again. Jarek stepped inside and drove the saber guard into the side of Lothar's ruined face. Bone cracked. The dead eye burst. Lothar reeled, whining now, but still smiling, still trying to raise the training sword as if desperate not to disappoint some unseen master. From beyond the open doorway came slow applause. Lord Varric Drow stood there in the lantern glow, crimson armor stripped down to a black quilted arming coat, pale hands bare, expression serene. Behind him, the servant held the light high, and in that shifting gold Jarek saw more than one changed shape in alcoves beyond the practice room. Some moved, some only twitched. "You see," Droll said softly, "why I keep the exceptional close." Lothar sagged against his chain, one eye socket leaking, chest heaving pointlessly, training sword still clenched in broken fingers. He looked not dead, not alive, but trapped in a third condition too pitiful to name. Drow's gaze never left Jarek's face. "The defeated need not be wasted," he said, and in the cellar crypts beneath the manor, with the smell of opened bodies and old stone all around him, Jarek finally understood what Schlechtburg had truly become. Not a court, not a sanctuary, not a place of law, but a stable, a feeding yard, a kennel of killers, where the dead were chewed hollow and the living were fattened for the next dawn. Chapter 3. The Kennel of Champions. Jarek Falk did not sleep after the cellar. He lay on the narrow bed in his chamber at the Vogt Manor, with his boots still on, one hand resting near the saber on the stool beside him, and listened to the house breathe around him. Old houses always breathed. Timber creaked. Settling stone gave little sighs. Wind worried at shutter latches and found the cracks in warped frames. But this house had other noises in it, and once a man had heard them he could never again mistake them for innocent things. Below, somewhere under the floorboards and flagstones, something heavy dragged across stone and paused. A chain gave one brief metallic chatter. Then silence. Then, after some long while, a muffled cry that ended in a sound like someone gargling soup through broken teeth. Jerick stared at the dark and waited for dawn that would never quite come soon enough. His lip had swollen where Lothar's forehead had split it. His gums throbbed. There was a bruise ripening along his ribs from one of the madman's blunted swings. He could still smell the practice room in the back of his throat, still taste it, a foul blend of grave damp, rusted iron, old blood soaked into sand, and the sweetish rot of meat that had been hurt too many times to remember what shape it once had. He had seen soldiers hacked open on battlefields, had walked among the dead after pike walls broke and artillery chewed men to swaying red mist. He had fought in breaches where the mud underfoot became porridge from brains and rainwater, but there had been a purpose to those slaughters, or at least a reason men told themselves after the fact. What he had seen below the manor was not war. It was appetite, taught etiquette. At grey light a servant came with hot water, bread, and a strip of smoked eel. The fellow bowed as if nothing in the world were amiss. His sleeves were neat, his nails were clean. The tray did not tremble in his hands. "My lord requests your presence at the east yard after sunrise," he said. Jerick looked at him over the rim of the basin. "Does he?" "Yes, Master Falk." The title sat badly on the servant's tongue, not because it was false, but because in this house, mastery meant being led by a silver chain instead of a rope. Jerick washed the blood from his face and went. The east yard had once been a herb garden, enclosed by a low wall. Now it was packed earth trampled hard by boots, and lined with straw dummies, pell posts, quintains, and wooden racks of practice weapons. Armor hung under the overhangs in ordered rows. Brigandines, half-plate harness, buff coats, helms dented and fresh burnished, shields of every shape. Men were already at work. Some drilled with sword and buckler, some sparred with rebaited blades. One bare-armed brute with scar tissue wrapping his torso like rope was pummeling a sand-filled sack until blood ran from his knuckles. Another man, broad and hawk-nosed, practiced stepping cuts with such concentration he seemed to carve lines through the air visible only to himself. No one laughed. No one spoke above a murmur. They were not companions here. They were caged dogs smelling one another through the bars. Duel stood beneath the open arcade in a dark riding coat over his crimson cuirass, watching the exercises with the grave approval of a priest at worship. Morning light touched his face and did nothing to soften it. He turned as Jerick entered and smiled by the narrowest degree. "You saw more than I intended," he said. "That was almost funny." Jerick kept his expression flat. "I saw enough." "Yes." Duel's gaze wandered back to the training men. "And yet you came. There are worse ways to die than fed and armed. That is a mercenary's wisdom. It has kept me breathing." Duel inclined his head as though acknowledging a point in a philosophical debate, rather than discussing kennel terms with a man who had seen his lower vault full of broken revenants. "The world is crude with its talent," he said. "It squanders the excellent. Hangings, lynchings, tavern stabbings, fever, arrows loosed by peasants who cannot even name the men they kill. It disgusts me." He gestured to the yard. "These are survivors. Men the world tried and did not break. Men with edge, nerve, ambition, rage. Men fit to decide matters of consequence in honest violence. Do you know what most rulers do with such men, Falk? They waste them in ranks. They bury them under command. They spend them for acreage and tariffs. I refine them. Jarek looked over the champions again. A wiry stallion with ears scarred by knife nicks. A former halberdier with one eye milked blind, and a left hand missing 2 fingers. A giant from the north country with a boiled leather gorget and the flattened nose of a pit fighter. A woman in a sleeveless jack, hair braided tight to the scalp, methodically drawing and striking with a cleaver like falchion. All dangerous, all hungry, all wearing the same expression, whether they knew it or not. The hard stillness of animals waiting to learn whether the next hand offered meat or punishment. "And when they lose?" Jarek asked. Draal's mouth became a bloodless line of amusement. "Then they continue to serve in lesser ways." He left it there, because leaving things unsaid gave them more power. Jarek was assigned quarters in the barracks by noon. They were the old stables converted for human use. The stalls had been widened, the partitions partly knocked through, but the place still smelled of horse beneath the newer scents of men, and steel oats gone stale in cracks, ammonia soaked deep into old timber, leather, hay dust, and the greasy tang of harness oil. 20 cots filled the long hall. Chests stood at their feet. Hooks along the walls held helmets, cloaks, whetstones, belts, and spare boots. At the far end a blackened brazier gave grudging warmth, and above it a trophy arrangement of snapped blades and split shields made it look as if some war god had vomited up a shrine. Favored champions lived here close together, ate together, drank under watch, bled in the same yard, and were taken to the frost field in Draal's own wagons. Every convenience was provided. Fresh bandages, better meat than the town could afford, ale not yet turned, salves and clean cloth, a surgeon on call, whores sometimes, though only selected and watched, dice, cards, a bathhouse cart brought up once a week, all the comforts of valued property. The bars, Jarek discovered, was social as much as iron. A man could leave the manor. No chain stopped him. No gate barred him daylight passage. But once he had eaten Draal's food, and fought in Draal's service, and taken Draal's coin, Schlechtburg began to close around him. Innkeepers informed, clerks observed, enforcers followed at a distance. The town itself had become an extension of the manor's leash. Everyone now had cause to keep the champions where they were. The merchants profited from them. The grieving needed them. The fearful worshipped them. The gossiping drunkards made legends of them. Even the priests, hollow-eyed and ashamed, found that the new law brought orderly rites and fewer spontaneous mobs. A man who broke from Draal's stable did not escape into freedom. He escaped into an ecosystem built to drive him back. Jarek saw this clearly within 3 days. He went down to the square at midday in a plain cloak and no visible crest, intending nothing more than beer and observation. The place seethed like a wound. Scribes sat at tables beneath awnings, scratching down accusations while plaintiffs leaned in with fervent eyes. Armorers hammered dents from cuirasses. Boys hogged broadside sheets naming upcoming dawn contests and listing the champions retained for each side. A barrel-chested butcher shouted odds as though announcing horse races. Near the old gallows stump left in place as a warning or relic, nobody seemed sure which a mother held her dead son's bloodied cap, while bargaining with a one-eyed axeman over the fee required to stand for family honor. The axeman listened with the solemnity of a lawyer, then doubled his price when he noticed the size of the crowd gathering to hear. A pair of little girls skipped past Jerick, chanting, "Champion for the dead, champion for the thief, cut him in the belly and grind out his teeth," in the cheerful sing-song used for counting games. At a pie stall, two merchants in furred caps discussed whether the dockmaster's murder charge against his own cousin would draw a better audience if the accused retained the woman with the falchion from Droll's yard, or the giant Northman with the scarred arms. "Her," one said. "She smiles when she cuts." "No," said the other, wiping grease into his beard. "Him. He tears men apart ugly. Crowd likes ugly." The fact that they spoke of it like theatre made Jerick's hand itch toward his knife. He bought ale and stood by a post, watching as a clerk from the manor guided a stooped cooper through the phrasing of a formal complaint. The old man's daughter, it seemed, had died in childbed after a brawl months earlier in which her husband had kicked her in the belly. Under older law, it would have gone nowhere. Now, with the right language and enough witness statements massaged into shape, it could be transformed into capital matter. Justice, perhaps, or vengeance opportunistically ripened. The clerk never told the man what to feel. He only supplied a structure into which feeling could be poured until it hardened into blood. A familiar voice spoke near Jerick's elbow. "See how civil we've become." Conrad Veit stood there in his stained leather apron, carrying a satchel that clinked with glass and steel. The barber surgeon's eyes were rimmed red from poor sleep and worse sights. "You should not be seen talking to me," Jerick said. Conrad gave a mirthless snort. "I should not be seen doing half the things that keep this place stitched together." They walked a little way through the press. Conrad kept his head down. "It worsens," the surgeon murmured. "The charges, the bodies, the returns. Father Heilwig says prayers over coffins with less in them each week. I've seen corpses where the wounds of the duel weren't enough to kill, not by themselves. I've seen punctures, collapse in the veins, drained tissue, and still the town calls it order because there are more coins in circulation and fewer random knifings after dark." He glanced sideways at Jerick. "You've seen below." Jerick said nothing. "That's answer enough." A roar rolled over the square. The crowd parted to admit a caged wagon coming from the hill. Inside, behind iron lattice, sat two bound men and a woman with her head shaved on one side where a scalp wound had been stitched. Their faces were mottled from beatings. Above them a board displayed the charges in chalk: murder, arson, kinslaying. People surged closer for a look. Some jeered, some crossed themselves. One old woman spat and screamed for all three to be cut in strips. The woman in the cage met Jerick's eyes for an instant. There was no plea in them. Only fury. "Another morning's entertainment," Conrad said. "Do you know what Father Heilwig told me yesterday? He said he fears not Drall's evil, but what happens if Drall dies? The town has grown used to spectacle, used to grievance made public and blood made meaningful. They will not surrender it willingly. They've dressed their appetites in vestments and call them law." He moved off before Jerick could answer. That evening Drall held supper for 6 of his chosen. They ate in a vaulted hall lit by beeswax tapers and an enormous hearth where venison hissed over coals. Fine silver at table, heavy goblets, good wine, dark bread, hot and fragrant, gravy rich enough to make a peasant weep. Drall presided at the head with the serene manners of a princeling. He asked each champion about preferred weapons, old campaigns, the worst wound ever survived, the nature of fear before combat. He listened with frightening attention. He remembered everything. He praised not brutality alone, but precision, temperament, adaptation under stress. When the giant Northman described wrenching a spear through a man's rib cage and using the same thrust to unhorse a second opponent, Duel smiled as warmly as another host might at a clever anecdote from court. "You understand continuity," he said. "Waste offends me. Violence should unfold." The others glowed under it. That was the genius of him, Jarek realized. Duel did not merely reward killers. He made them feel seen in the deepest and ugliest part of themselves. Men who had spent their lives being used for their violence suddenly found themselves admired for its artistry. He fed not only their bellies and purses, but the half-buried conviction every fighter carried that he was more than butcher's labor, that there was meaning in the cut, if only the right eye beheld it. After supper, Duel requested demonstration bouts in the torchlit stable yard. The champions obliged eagerly. Blunted swords rang. Sand flew. Men grunted and circled and slammed together under the orange light, while grooms and servants watched from the shadows. Duel stood near enough to smell the sweat, hands clasped behind his back. When one man disarmed another with a rolling bind and a kick to the knee, Duel nodded. When the woman with the falchion took a Northman across the scalp and opened him to the bone despite the blunted edge, Duel's eyes shone as though someone had sung beautifully. Then he called Jarek's name. "Again," the vampire said, "with Rausch." Rausch was the hawk-nosed former halberdier, a man who fought like an engineer, dismantling a siege gate, methodically, with contempt for flesh. He stepped into the ring with a training sword and a heater shield scarred by previous bouts. Jarek took rebaited saber and dagger. The other champions drew back. "First blood?" asked Rausch. Duel considered. "First failure. They came together hard." Rausch used the shield like a butcher uses a block, smashing in, short and brutal, trying to deny Jarek room. His training sword whipped in behind the rim, jabbing at face, throat, armpit. Jarek slipped the first thrust, beat the second wide with his dagger, and chopped for Rausch's lead knee. Wood cracked against shield edge. Rausch bull-rushed him, iron boss slamming into his chest. Breath burst from Jarek's lungs. He staggered, caught himself, nearly ate the follow-up strike to the temple, and ducked under it by instinct more than sight. The champions barked approval. Duel said nothing. Rausch hammered him backward across the yard. Saber and trainer blade rang so fast the sounds merged. Jarek felt one shot numb his sword hand to the elbow. Another clipped his shoulder and turned the arm half dead. He dropped low, stabbed with the dagger at Rausch's calf, and got only leather. Rausch kicked him in the face. Jarek saw a white flare and tasted blood. Before he could recover, the shield crashed down on the back of his neck and drove him to one knee in the sand. "Up," said Duel softly. Jarek rose snarling. Something changed then. Not in his body, in his temper. He stopped trying to outfight Rausch cleanly and began fighting to ruin him. When Rausch pressed again behind the shield, Jarek yielded ground just enough to invite overreach, then trapped the shield rim with dagger and saber together, wrenched downward, and stamped on the man's foot. Bones crunched inside the boot. Rausch grunted. Jarek headbutted him square in the nose. Cartilage burst with a mushy pop. Blood sheeted. Jerek chopped the rebated saber across the side of Rausch's neck, hard enough to weld to nearly drop him. Then he drove the dagger hilt into Rausch's eye socket. Rausch screamed and folded. Jerek snatched the shield from his arm and battered him with it, once across the mouth, once across the ear, once on the crown. Teeth sprayed into the torchlight. Rausch dropped his sword and clawed blindly at the air. Jerek kicked him in the side of the knee. The joint bent the wrong way with a nauseating crack. The halberdier went down in a heap, howling through blood. Jerek planted a boot on his chest and leveled the rebated saber at the ruined face. Silence held the yard. Then Duel laughed, not loudly, not vulgarly. A delighted little exhalation, intimate and terrible. "Do you feel it?" he asked. Jerek turned his head. Duel had stepped forward, the torchlight making his eyes look almost black around their blood-dark cores. There was color in his cheeks now, a faint flush, like someone who had just swallowed hot wine. "The instant where craft gives way to truth," the vampire said. "Technique is a language. Pain is grammar. But there comes a moment in worthy combat when the soul steps naked into the blow. That is what lesser men cannot understand. They think violence is merely ending. It is revelation." Rausch writhed under Jerek's boot, gagging blood through broken teeth. One eye was swelling shut. The other rolled wild as a horse's. Duel looked at Jerek, the way other men looked at relics or beautiful weapons. "I have arranged a contest for 3 mornings hence," he said. "A matter of some delicacy. A widow accuses the watch sergeant who beat her son to death in a debtor's cell. The watch insists the boy died of seizure. There are witnesses on both sides. The crowd will be enormous. The sergeant has retained Geralt Bray." A murmur moved through the champions. Even Jerek felt it like a draft. Geralt Bray was no town bravo or kennel cur. He was a genuine killer from the wars, a bastard knight without a patent, famous in 3 provinces for surviving roots that had eaten better men. He fought in half-plate with long sword and rondel, and had once split a horseman's skull to the teeth in a judicial combat outside Nuln. Men crossed the street to avoid his shadow. He had arrived in Schlechtburg the previous day with 2 squires, a chaplain, and scars enough to map a campaign. "Geralt takes the accused," Duel said. "You, Falk, will stand for the widow." Jerek said nothing. Duel's smile sharpened. "I have watched you among these men, watched your patience, your refusal to posture, your capacity to absorb, shape, and answer it with invention. Rausch is competent. The others are vivid. But you," he stepped closer, "you improve under pressure. You become yourself when pain strips choice away. That is rare." He raised one pale hand and, with obscene familiarity, touched the fresh blood at the corner of Jerek's mouth. His thumb lingered there a moment. "I have not enjoyed anticipation like this in many years." Jerek fought the urge to cut him where he stood, and knew as he felt it that Duel had planned even for that possibility, that the yard, the champions, the servants in shadow, the armed retainers by the arcade, all were arranged not merely for safety but for flavor. The vampire wanted resistance, wanted fury, wanted ripening. Across the yard, Rausch dragged himself in the sand, leaving a snail track of blood and spit. In the square below the hill, bells began to ring for evening market, and with them rose the distant buzz of Schlechtburg's appetite buyers, mourners, clerks, gossips, children at play, families choosing champions, merchants counting coin, priests blessing a system they hated because it had made itself indispensable. The whole town had become part of the snare. And standing there with blood drying on his lips and Dral's chosen contest hanging before him like an executioner's cord, Jarek understood at last that he had not merely been spared, housed, and tested. He had been cultivated. Every duel, every supper, every observed bout, every whispered praise, every glimpse of horror below the manor, every chance to harden, every carefully selected opponent, every narrowing path through Schlechtburg's greedy new order had been shaping him toward one end. Lord Varrig Drau did not merely want a champion. He wanted a masterpiece. And Jarek Falk, by the patient design of a monster who revered slaughter as an art, had been maneuvered into becoming the finest blade the vampire had yet whetted for his own hand. Chapter 4. Dawn for the Dead. The charge was laid at dusk. By then Schlechtburg had already learned to hunger most keenly in the hours before dark, when the market square filled with the smoke of cook fires and the talk of accusation. Men came off the river with wet cuffs and sore backs, women from the wash lines and slaughter sheds, boys from errands, drunks from the ale benches, all of them drifting toward the square, because that was where the town's new soul now lived. The old gallows stump still stood at one side of the market like a rotten tooth, hacked down at the beam but never fully torn free, and around it the clerks of Lord Varric Dral worked their tables in the last red light of evening. Wax tablets, seals, ledgers, witness rolls, oaths, copied in a beautiful hand for ugly purposes. Jarek Falk saw the thing begin before he understood it. He had come down from the manor alone and unhelmed, with a plain cloak over his brigandine and the ache of bad sleep in his eyes. Geralt Bray's duel was set for dawn. The widow who had retained Jarek sat under a wool shawl near the scrivener's table, white-faced and rigid, her hands folded around her dead son's prayer token until the cords showed in the backs of them. She did not speak to him. She did not need to. Grief had already paid his fee. It sat in the line of her shoulders and the hollow around her mouth. The square was thick with bodies and noise. A skinner haggled over lamp oil. A cutler shouted prices on sharpened belt knives fit for formal grievance. Somebody had started singing a filthy song about a champion who gutted 3 brothers before breakfast, and the crowd joined in on the refrain. Children played Duel in the muck with willow rods, screaming with delight each time one fell theatrically and spat red berry pulp to mimic blood. A priest of Moor moved through the throng with his head lowered and his little black icon hidden half beneath his robe, as though even death's own servants had become ashamed to be seen. Then the shouting started near the cooper's well. Not common tavern shouting, not the hot, shapeless kind. This had structure. Men were making a ring. Voices rose in accusation, in witness, in formal repetition of names and acts. That was how it worked now. Any private ugliness could be skinned and stretched over public ritual until it looked like justice. Jarek pushed through bodies in time to see Conrad Veit, the barber surgeon, dragged to his knees in the mud. 2 of Dral's enforcers held him by the arms. Another stood with split lip and blood on his cheek, as if Conrad had tried to resist and paid for the courage with bruises. The old surgeon's spectacles were gone. One side of his face had been driven into the cobbles hard enough to leave skin hanging loose at the brow. Blood ran into his beard. He looked not frightened, not entirely, but stunned in the way a man looks when the trap snaps before he has even scented bait. A clerk from the manor unrolled a parchment and raised his voice. Conrad Veit, surgeon and barber of Schleckberg, is charged upon witness and confession of evidence with the unlawful poisoning and murder of Father Heilwig, priest of Moor, in conspiracy to subvert due judgment and incite rebellion against the lawful redress of blood. The square drew in breath like one creature. Father Heilwig lay nearby under a black cloth. Only one bony hand showed, pale against the boards of the bier. Jarek did not need to see the face. He had known the old priest's gait, the stoop of him, the smell of dust and lamp wax and old wool. Known, too, that Heilwig had feared Dral's law but lacked the spine or strength to challenge it openly. Poisoning was nonsense. Conspiracy was theater. Yet theater was all Schleckberg needed now. Conrad tried to rise. A mailed fist slammed into his mouth and set him back down. When he spoke, blood sprayed through his broken lip. I did not kill him. The clerk did not look at him. 3 witnesses place you near the temple cup. 2 testify to seditious speech against the Lord's settlement. Further evidence. Evidence bought, Conrad snarled. A cudgel struck him in the kidneys. He folded forward with a raw cry. Jarek felt eyes turning to him all through the crowd. Not openly, not yet, but enough. They all knew Conrad had spoken to him. The town knew everything that might ripen into drama. Around the bier, people began to mutter. Some crossed themselves for the dead priest. Some spat on the ground near Conrad. Some looked thrilled. Then Jarek saw Dral. The vampire stood on the chapel steps beyond the square, not cloaked, not hidden, but plain in his crimson armor, one gauntleted hand resting on the pommel of his long sword. Evening light made him look almost warm, almost human. His expression held grave disappointment, the perfect, lordly sorrow of a ruler pained by treachery among his servants. He did not smile. He did not need to. The shape of the trap was visible everywhere at once. Heilwig dead, Conrad accused. Witnesses prepared. Crowd gathered. Jarek already retained for a dawn duel of uncommon size and spectacle. The vampire had not merely arranged a murder. He had arranged a harvest. The widow at Jarek's side made a low sound. They'll give Bray my case, she whispered. They'll say this is larger now, that it touches the peace of the town. Jarek did not answer. A 4th enforcer came through the crowd holding up a leather satchel. He opened it dramatically and spilled its contents onto the bier beside Heilwig's body. Vials, powders, folded packets of herbs, a lancet wrapped in cloth, Conrad's tools. All ordinary in a surgeon's practice, presented this way, under a corpse and before a hungry square. They looked like the devices of a poisoner. The clerk raised his chin. By Lord Dral's law, the accused may stand or be represented at dawn. Let any with claim to Father Heilwig's justice declare now, and let any who would answer for Conrad Veit declare in turn. No one moved. The silence had heat in it. Anticipation, terror, delight. Conrad turned his battered face toward Jarek. There was no plea in it, only a sort of exhausted contempt. He knew as well as Jarek did that if Jarek stepped forward he would become part of Dral's grand performance. If he did not, Conrad would be butchered under forms and witnesses while the town congratulated itself on civility. Jarek stepped into the ring. I answer for Conrad Veit, he said. The square came alive. People shouted. Some laughed aloud in disbelief. Others began talking over one another, so loudly their words blurred into one greedy noise. The widow cried out behind him, more in shock than anger. The clerk's eyes flicked toward Duel on the chapel steps. The vampire descended slowly into the square. He looked first at the bier, then at Conrad, then at Jerick, as though weighing all three in some private balance. "So be it," Duel said. "Father Heilwig shall have justice. Conrad Veit shall have representation. Because the matter touches both temple and public peace, I name the dead priest's champion myself." Of course he did. "Geralt Bray," Duel said. The name moved through the crowd like cold water. Geralt stepped from beside the chapel door, where he had apparently been waiting all along. He wore half-plate blackened at the edges, a mail standard, and a longsword whose grip had darkened from years of sweat. He was taller than Jerick by half a head, broad through the shoulders, with a face cut from scar tissue and old insolence. One ear was missing. A puckered wound had once opened his scalp and left a pale seam in the hairline. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had killed too long to belong cleanly to the living. His mouth curled when he saw Jerick. "This improves the morning," he said. Duel's gaze lingered on Jerick with a terrible tenderness. "Yes," the vampire said, "it does. That night, the manor was a hive. Servants ran with linens, oil, and fresh torches. Armorers checked rivets by lantern glow. Scribes carried sealed notices to every quarter of the town, summoning witnesses and claimants, broadening the legal dignity of the event until half of Schleckburg now believed itself implicated in the murder of Father Heilwig. In the stables, the champions sharpened blades and speculated openly on how Jerick might fare against Bray. Some favored the knight's reach and strength. Some said Jerick's footwork would undo him. More than one hoped both men would cripple one another so badly that places would open higher in Duel's favor. Jerick ignored them. He sat on his cot cleaning his saber with slow strokes of cloth and oil while Conrad Veit, under guard, was kept in a locked room 3 doors away. Near midnight, the woman with the falchion came and leaned one shoulder against the post at the end of his bed. "You could run," she said. "No," she nodded as though confirming something. "They'll shut the gates by second bell, not to keep you in, to keep the crowd from forcing its way up the hill too soon." Her eyes were unreadable in the dark. "Bray will try your sword first, then your lead leg. He likes to break rhythm by breaking bone." "Thank you," she shrugged. "I don't do it for you. I do it because if you kill him, the yard changes." When she was gone, Jerick rose and went out by the back stair with his sword, dagger, and a hooded lantern. The graveyard slope below the manor lay under a skin of frost. Graves crouched in rows like broken teeth. The black temple of Mor stood squat and exhausted at the edge of the hill, its little yard walled in low stone and thorn. The earth near the crypts showed signs of recent traffic even in moonlight. Ruts, boot marks, scuffed soil, the pressed places where weight had passed repeatedly. Jerick moved among the stones until he found what he wanted. Father Heilwig's burial ground, already opened, priest's box waiting, rites half prepared. Consecrated earth. The old man had spent 30 years blessing this slope for the dead. Whether his own faith had thinned at the end or not, the ground kept the memory. Jerick set the lantern behind a headstone and worked in silence. From the abandoned smithy near the chapel he stole a length of chain and 2 rusting iron stakes used once for tethering cart mules. From the cooper's shed he took a mallet. From the chapel store, after forcing a side shutter, he took a brass sun mirror used at solstice observance, polished enough still to catch dawn. He drove one stake deep at the head of Heilwig's grave, another at the foot, then stretched the chain low between them beneath a skin of disturbed earth. A horse might shy from it. A man rushing in poor light might not see it at all. Then he angled the mirror on a broken marker facing east, where the sunrise would clear the ridge. It was not much. Against a vampire, nothing was much. But Duel had built his law on ritual and witness. That meant he had to come close enough to be seen. Before first bell, Jarek went to Conrad. The guards at the locked room were sleepy and bored. They recognized him and let him inside long enough to say what he had to say. Conrad sat against the wall with bruises flowering black and purple over his jaw and throat. One eye had closed completely. Yet when he heard Jarek's plan, a cracked smile touched his face. "You think the town will care?" "No," Jarek said. "Not until they see. And if they still do not, then it was always going to end in slaughter." Conrad nodded once. "Good. I'd rather die in truth than live as one more line in his ledger." The frost field east of Schlechtburg had never held so many people. They came before dawn with lanterns and pitch torches, clogging the roads, the ditches, the hedges, the low walls, every vantage from which a human neck could crane. Wagons were turned into viewing platforms. Ale vendors did a roaring trade. Women sold hot onions and black bread from baskets. Priests muttered prayers no one listened to. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Men took bets with greasy hands and eager eyes. The town had dressed for festival around a murder trial. The sky was iron gray. Frost whitened the grass. Breath moved in the field like smoke from invisible fires. At the center stood the dueling ground, ringed with ropes. On one side waited Jarek in brigandine, open-faced helm, saber and dagger. On the other stood Geralt Bray in half-plate, long sword bare, rondel at hip, his breath steaming through his beard. Between them a bier had been set with Father Heilwig's covered body, and beside it a stool for the accused. Conrad sat there bound but upright, flanked by two enforcers. His face had been washed clean enough that the bruising showed all the more starkly. Lord Varric Duel arrived last, as any tyrant should. He rode a black horse caparisoned in dark mail and crimson cloth. Behind him came his retainers, his clerks, his chosen champions, and two covered wagons whose contents nobody wished to name aloud. He dismounted before the bier and removed his gauntlets with slow care, handing them to a servant. The crowd quieted by degrees until only the snorting of horses and the far cawing of crows could be heard. Duel raised his voice. "Schlechtburg gathers to see blood, answered openly and under witness. Let no man say judgment here is hidden. Father Heilwig, servant of the dead, has been slain. Conrad Veit stands accused. Geralt Bray answers for the dead priest. Jarek Falk answers for the accused. Let steel discover truth where tongues have tangled it." Jarek heard the wording and understood the final shape of it. Not merely let steel discover guilt. No, Duel meant something more intimate. He always had. Geralt saluted with his blade. Jarek did not. "Begin," said Duel. Geralt came forward in measured steps, sword point alive, shoulders easy. No bellow, no flourish. He was too old for bravado. The first cut was a testing forehand toward Jarek's head. Jarek turned it aside and felt the force through his wrist like a hammer strike. The second thrust came immediately low for the belly, driven with deceptive speed. Jarek slipped outside it and slashed for Bray's sword hand. Steel rang, sparks jumped. The knight recovered with ugly efficiency and shouldered into him, using weight and harness to force space into closeness. The crowd roared at first contact. Bray's long sword worked in short, murderous lines, all economy, all certainty. He chopped at Jarek's lead leg just as the woman had warned, then reversed into a thrust for the throat. Jarek caught the flat on his dagger and felt the dagger shiver, nearly loose from his grip. Bray's pommel smashed into his cheekbone. White burst behind Jarek's eyes. He staggered away, barely ducking the follow-up cut that would have opened him ear to collar. The field howled approval. Jarek circled, boots crunching frost. He tasted blood already. Bray advanced without hurry, patient as winter. He knew exactly what he was selling the crowd. Inevitability. They traded again. Jarek chopped at the knee. Bray checked it with the lower edge of his blade and answered with a backhand that tore 3 rivets loose from Jarek's brigandine and laid open the flesh beneath in a long hot stripe. Jarek hissed through his teeth and lunged with the dagger. Bray let him close, then rammed the crossguard of the longsword into Jarek's mouth. Teeth clicked. Blood splashed across both of them. Bray shoved him back and slashed downward. The blade bit into Jarek's left shoulder, not deep enough to cripple, but deep enough to make the arm go slick and numb in an instant. The crowd was no longer cheering names. It was cheering wounds. Jarek gave ground, turned, and almost slipped in the churned frost. Bray pressed, sword rising and falling with relentless exactness. A cut shaved Jarek's helm and sparked from the brow. Another punched through the outer leather of his thigh. Then Bray stepped in on a shieldless bind and kneed him hard in the groin. Jarek folded. Bray seized a fistful of his hair and hacked the long sword crosswise at his face. Jarek got the dagger up just in time. Steel screamed against steel inches from his eyes. The impact drove the dagger hilt into his own teeth. He bit his tongue half through. Bray leaned all his weight onto the bind, face close enough that Jarek saw the burst veins in his nose and the old crater of a scar under one eye. "You were chosen to season the morning," Bray said softly. Jarek drove his forehead into Bray's mouth. Bone cracked. Teeth flew. Bray reeled, snarling red. Jarek tore free and slashed at the knight's armpit. The saber cut through mail links, bit flesh, and drew the first true gush from him. The field erupted. Bray looked almost offended, then grinned through blood and came harder. What followed lost the shape of fencing and became work. They hacked and slammed and grappled through the white grass, boots tearing up frozen turf, steel punching sparks from steel, breath ripping from lungs like torn cloth. Bray opened Jarek's forearm to the tendon. Jarek split Bray's scalp to the bone, and blood sheeted hot down the knight's face, blinding one eye. Bray rammed the rondel into Jarek's side through the gap under the ribs and nearly gutted him. Jarek caught the wrist, twisted until ligaments popped, and bit the man's torn mouth to the gum. They broke apart slick with one another's blood and crashed together again. The crowd screamed for more. On the bier, Father Heilwig lay under black cloth, forgotten already by most. Drall watched from beside the ring, utterly still. That was the moment Jarek chose. He sprang back from Bray's next rush and shouted, not at his opponent, but at the field. "Conrad did not kill Heilwig." The words carried because he put blood and breath and desperation into them all at once. The sudden break in motion caught the crowd off guard. Bray hesitated, only for a heartbeat, but that heartbeat widened as Jarek pointed his saber directly at Drawl. He did. Noise crashed up from the field, shocked and furious and delighted. The best entertainment was always scandal. Drawl did not blink. "You speak wildly to save your client," he said. Jarek spat blood into the frost. "You murdered the priest because he had seen too much. Ask the surgeon why your dead come back pale. Ask the graveyard why the earth is always broken. Ask your own crypts what feeds below them. Ask Lothar Sen if he still remembers his name between beatings." The name stirred murmurs among those who recalled the vanished champion. Conrad, bruised and bound on his stool, drew breath and shouted through split lips. "I saw the punctures. I saw the drained corpses. Heilwig knew. He feared to speak, and so you silenced him." Gerald Bray turned his head just enough to look at Drawl. Only just enough. That was all Jarek needed. He lunged and drove the saber across Bray's sword arm. The cut bit deep. Tendons parted. The long sword dropped from numb fingers. Bray bellowed and rammed into Jarek's shoulder first, taking them both into the mud and frost. They rolled. Bray got on top and hammered the rondel down. Jarek trapped the wrist with both hands. The point punched into his side anyway, shallow this time, slicing skin and meat. Bray snarled and headbutted him. Cartilage crunched in Jarek's nose. The world flashed white. Around them, the crowd had become a sea in storm. Some shouted liar, some shouted monster, some only shouted because there was blood and confusion, and that was enough. Drawl raised one hand for silence. That was his mistake. He was still trying to conduct the spectacle, to master it through form. Jarek hooked his leg behind Bray's wounded knee and rolled. They came up half-standing, clinched chest to chest, Bray punching at him with the ruined sword hand while clawing for the dagger with the good. Jarek slammed his forehead into the knight's cut scalp. Bray sagged. Jarek ripped the rondel free from Bray's belt and drove it up under the chin. The blade punched through tongue, palate, and into the brain. Bray convulsed once, a savage, full-body spasm that sprayed blood and bits of broken tooth across Jarek's face. Then he went slack. Jarek shoved the corpse down into the frost and turned on Drawl. "Then stand yourself," he roared. "If your law means anything, stand. Champion for the dead priest, champion for the accused. No more kennels, no more wagons, no more cellar beasts. Stand in sight of your own justice. Stand in sight of your own justice." The field froze. It was madness. It was blasphemy. It was exactly the language Drawl had taught them all. Public witness, honor, challenge, open blood, beneath dawn. Every eye went to the vampire. For the first time since he had come to Schlechtburg, Lord Warek Drawl looked like something touched by irritation rather than amusement. Small, almost invisible, but there. He could have ordered his retainers forward. He could have had Jarek shot with crossbows, or dragged down by 6 men at once. Yet to do so now, before this crowd, after months of preaching the sanctity of visible redress, would crack the mask he had worn so carefully. He had made himself prisoner of his own pageantry. Slowly he smiled. "As you wish," he said. He drew his long sword. The blade came free, whispering, black at the fuller and bright at the edge. An old sword, a cruel one. The field drew back without instruction, widening the ring. Even the horses shied. The first red seam of sunrise was just beginning behind the eastern ridge. Duel moved. He was faster than Bray had ever been, faster than any human had the right to see. One moment he stood 10 paces off. The next his sword was already at Jerrik's throat. Jerrik barely turned it. The impact numbed both arms and nearly spun him out of his boots. Duel cut high, low, thrust, reverse, all with ghastly grace, the blade seeming to appear where thought had not yet reached. Jerrik retreated in desperate half-steps, parrying by instinct, each contact jarring bone and opening him further. A slice across the ribs, a stab through the upper arm, a shallow cut over the brow that filled one eye with blood. Duel never over-committed, never breathed hard. He fought like certainty given steel. Jerrik tried a feint. Duel ignored it and opened his thigh. He tried a bind. Duel flowed around it and cut his ear nearly off. He tried to rush in close to make speed useless. Duel smashed the pommel into his sternum and drove him sprawling. The crowd was silent now, not with boredom, with awe. Jerrik got up because standing was the only thing left. The world had narrowed to pulses of pain and the sound of his own blood in his ears. Duel advanced through the whitening field, black cloak trailing, armor wet with dawn frost and other men's blood. He looked beautiful in the way avalanches look beautiful from a distance. "You were worth the shaping," he said. Then he came in for the kill. Jerrik gave ground exactly where he had prepared it. 1 step, 2, 3. Duel lunged, blade extending for the heart. Jerrik slipped aside at the last possible instant and let the vampire's own momentum carry him across the disturbed patch of ground before Heilwig's grave. Duel's leading boot caught the buried chain. For the smallest fraction of a second, his body broke alignment. For any man alive, it would have meant a stumble. For something this fast, it meant disaster. Jerrik hacked low with the saber and took Duel behind the knee. The blade bit through joined armor into the cords beneath. Black blood sprayed steaming across the frost. Duel dropped to one leg, more in shock than hurt. Jerrik hurled himself bodily into him. They crashed together onto the consecrated ground, rolling against Father Heilwig's open grave. Duel was impossibly strong. His free hand closed around Jerrik's throat and crushed until vertebrae ground. The vampire's face was inches away now, beautiful no longer, the hunger in it naked and ancient. His lips peeled back from white teeth too long to be human. Jerrik smashed the brass sun mirror into Duel's face. It shattered across cheek and eye, flashing the newborn light into them at the exact instant the sun broke the ridge. The first beam struck like a thrown spear. Duel screamed, not shouted, not roared, screamed with a high tearing sound no man's throat should make, as if every vein in him had become molten at once. Smoke erupted from his exposed flesh. The skin of his face blistered black in spreading veins. One eye burst with a wet pop and ran steaming down his cheek. He flung Jerrik away with strength born of agony, but in doing so rolled fully across Heilwig's grave, onto the earth the old priest had blessed through decades of burial rites. Jerrik hit the ground, gagging, saw the stakes he had set, and understood. He lurched up, half-blind, seized the chain with both ruined hands, and dragged it high across Duel's chest and throat. The vampire clawed at it, burning where it touched consecrated earth and dawn-lit metal alike. Jarek looped the chain once around the headstake and pulled until every torn muscle in his back screamed. Duel rose half off the ground with a sound like boiling marrow, armor smoking, black blood hissing in the frost. The crowd had found its voice again. Now it was not cheering, it was shrieking. Some ran, some fell to their knees, some stared as if seeing religion stripped naked and flayed. Conrad Veit, still bound, was laughing and crying together. Duel surged once, twice, nearly breaking free. His hand seized Jarek's wrist and the pressure in them was inhuman. Bones cracked. Jarek screamed and held on. Sunlight climbed. More of it struck the vampire's face, his throat. The hand that gripped the chain. Flesh split. Flame licked from the seams of his armor. The smell was hideous beyond words. Burnt blood, scorched hair, opened tomb, hot corruption boiled dry. Then the black-clad servants from the wagons ran forward, not to save Jarek, to save their lord. They threw themselves at the chain, at the stakes, at Jarek's bleeding hands. One slashed at his forearm with a knife. Jarek headbutted him and heard the nose collapse. Another got hold of the chain and dragged. A champion from Duel's yard, Rausch, his legs still crooked from the stable bout, came limping in with a cudgel raised. And that broke the field. The town, already crazed by fear and revelation, erupted into total violence. Someone shouted, "The crypts!" Someone else, "Monster!" Then all restraint was gone. Bray's former backers charged Jarek with knives drawn. The widow's kin fell on them with clubs and pitchforks. Champions chose sides by instinct, grievance, or proximity. A horse screamed and kicked a man's face into ruin. An enforcer took a hatchet in the temple and spun down, spraying blood. Conrad's guards tried to drag him away. He bit one's thumb off to the knuckle and ran with his wrists bound. A crowd that had once stood neatly around rings and ropes now became the oldest law in the world. Panic, armed with tools. Jarek saw Rausch coming and drove the rondel into his belly up to the hilt. Rausch folded with both hands, trying stupidly to keep his insides in. The servant with the broken nose lunged again, and Jarek slashed his throat open so wide the man's head seemed to sit suddenly crooked. Hot blood jetted over the grave. At the chain, Duel's body was no longer a body in any natural sense. Parts of it had blackened to cinder. The face collapsed inward around exposed teeth. One gauntlet-clad hand still clawed blindly at the air while the other burned from finger to wrist. Yet something in him still lived and hated and fought to remain. Jarek planted a boot on the vampire's breastplate and hauled the chain tighter until the head stake tore half free from the ground. Duel's remaining eye fixed on him. In it, even now, there was admiration. Then the sunrise took him whole. Light poured across the graveyard slope, over field and stone and blood and panicked men, and Lord Varric Duel came apart beneath it. Not into ash in a clean storybook gust, but into wet, ruinous destruction. The skin burst first, splitting in long black cracks. Fire ran beneath it. The flesh beneath boiled. One side of the skull blackened and collapsed, jaw hanging by strings of cooked tissue. Black blood spat and hissed on the blessed earth. Then the whole body sagged inward as if every tendon had been cut at once, armor clanging empty around something no longer coherent. Smoke rolled thick and greasy. The smell drove men vomiting into the grass. By the time Jarek staggered back, the crimson armor held only a smoldering, half liquefied horror and fragments of bone too dark to be human. The Lord of Slechtburg was dead. The killing did not stop. Without Droll's poise, without his forms and staged distances, the town's addiction showed its true face. The surviving champions turned on one another amid old scores and fresh fear. Men who had hired blades tried to flee payment and were cut down for it. Merchants were trampled in the rush. A child disappeared under running boots. Someone overturned one of the wagons, and the things inside came out blinking and shrieking, half-dead practice beasts from the crypts in armor straps and old scars, and the crowd hacked them to pieces in blind terror. Conrad Veit vanished into the melee with a stolen knife. The widow beat an enforcer's head against a wheel until it burst like dropped fruit. The field became a slaughterhouse without ritual. That, Jerick thought dimly as he leaned on his saber and watched men die in knots and puddles and snarling heaps, was the last honesty Droll had left behind. He had not created Schlechtburg's appetite. He had refined it, given it language, taught it posture. Now the posture had burned away. By midday the frost field was mud and carrion. By evening the old gallows stump in the square had been hauled upright again by frightened men who needed some simpler shape for justice, however ugly. They lashed a new beam across it, while the town still smoked from riot and burning carts. No speeches accompanied the work. No clerks recorded it. Nobody pretended the thing was noble. It only looked merciful by comparison. Jerick saw it from the edge of the square with his arm in a sling and his bandages already bleeding through. The rebuilt gallows leaned a little to one side. The rope hanging from it was fresh hemp, pale and clean against the darkening sky. Around its base, the people of Schlechtburg moved like survivors after plague, stunned, filthy, quieter than before but not wiser. Their faces still held that same old hunger, only now mixed with fear of what happened when hunger was dressed too richly. He turned away before full dark. Behind him, in the bruised evening light, the new gallows creaked softly over the square like a kind of threat.